There's a boat sailing the waters to the remote island of Iceland in 1938. There are smiling faces and tourists doing what they've always done and will continue to do, exploring the vastness of this country. These are the convoy routes between the UK and the Northern Hemisphere. This is where goods, supplies, ammo, troops would be moved between the two regions. See how these routes run right past Iceland?
1,800 air miles from Halifax, 825 miles from Scotland, and only 900 from Nazi-held Norway.
World War II, as its name suggests, involved a huge number of countries around the world. It spanned almost all of Europe, through North Africa, and traveled to the dense jungles of the Pacific, stretching all the way to North America. But one region forgotten in this conflict is the Nordic nation of Iceland. Despite its remote location on the map, many of the powers involved in the conflict saw the island as a point of great strategic value for their operations. At first, both the Germans and the British tried to negotiate through diplomatic channels with the Icelanders. But if their demands were not accommodated, both sides were prepared to take more drastic measures. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Iceland, the forgotten scene of World War II. Already a few years before the start of the war, Hitler seemed obsessed with Iceland. Eva Braun, his lover, and the one who would become his wife in his last days of life, also shared that fixation. The two met in 1929, before he became Germany's Führer. At the time, she was working in Munich as a model and assistant to Heinrich Hoffmann, the official photographer for the Nazi Party. A couple of years later, when she was 19 and Hitler was 42, they began a relationship. After the Nazis took over the government in 1933, Braun and the Führer began spending much more time together, without ever formalizing their relationship. Many of the photographs and videos that exist today of Adolf Hitler are footage of his mistress, and most of them show him in everyday life. He is seen playing with his dog, Blondie, or relaxing in his mountain retreat in Bavaria. There are also records of the vacations they took together. In July 1939, just 2 months before Nazi forces invaded Poland and started World War II, the couple traveled to Iceland.
And then there's shots of children smiling, playing, living. It's honestly beautiful footage. But when you pause this clip and think about who is the person holding this camera, the person zoomed into all of these kids' smiling faces, these people alive and well. The person holding this camera is Hitler's girlfriend. Her name was Eva Braun. She was the longtime confidant, girlfriend, and eventual wife of Adolf Hitler.
From existing videos, it is known that they visited the geysers, glaciers, and many of the still active volcanoes, as well as major cities such as Reykjavik, the country's capital. But the beautiful scenery was not the only reason they had planned the trip to this cold island. Much of the Nazi leadership admired one specific aspect of the country: its people. All members of the party believed that the Aryan race was undoubtedly superior to the rest of the world's people, especially in contrast to the Jews, Slavs, Roma, and other groups settled in Europe. Many of them saw Iceland's citizens as the people who came closest to their idea of human perfection, with the majority being light-skinned, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. For these reasons, Hitler believed that his racist ideology would resonate with the locals of this country. Therefore, he commissioned a diplomat named Werner Gerlach to try by all possible means to convert the island's civilians to Nazism. But German interest in the nation was not purely racially motivated. It also had a much more practical purpose. Almost all the sea routes used by British ships to bring equipment to the Northern Hemisphere passed through Iceland, whether they were bound for Norway or the United States. If the Germans succeeded in taking the country, either by diplomatic means or by force, they could freely attack these convoys. If, however, the islanders allied themselves with the British or were occupied by them, they would hinder the German conquests that Hitler was already planning on the western coast of Europe. On September 1st, 1939, World War II began with the German invasion of Poland. A month later, the defenders were defeated, and Hitler began to expand his territory. France and the United Kingdom quickly declared war on him, but for the rest of the year there were no further offensives. Those involved concentrated on consolidating their forces, knowing that the storm was coming. But this period of relative peace was shattered on April 9, 1940, by the simultaneous invasion of Denmark and Norway by the Nazis. Their aim was to prevent the Allies from using the ports of these Nordic countries to block maritime traffic. Although the British sent soldiers to assist in the resistance, 2 months later the Scandinavian armies had been defeated.
It was in the neutral Norwegian waters that Germany claimed the right to destroy neutral ships and murder non-combatant seamen against all international law. But when the Allies answered force with force, once again Germany marched to aggression. But no one outside Germany will believe that the ruthless invasion of Norway and Denmark, the occupation of the strategic Danish bridges, was not planned long ago.
Although these victories were important for the Third Reich, they did not mean the end of the danger in the northern seas. Sweden had not been invaded, as it still had close economic ties with Nazi Germany, being its main exporter of iron. But Iceland, despite Ambassador Gerlach's attempts, continued its position of neutrality. He had only managed to get a small group of young people to join the party, to the total disappointment of the Führer. The diplomat did not share Hitler and Himmler's obsession. He saw the island as a barren and desert place, and its people as primitive. But not wanting to anger his superiors, he continued with his attempts to recruit the population. But while the Nazi leader preferred assimilation to conquest, he was also making plans for the latter path. And he was not the only one. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, also saw Iceland as a point of great strategic value, which should not under any circumstances fall into German hands. He declared, "Whoever possesses Iceland has a gun firmly trained on England, America, and Canada." Like the Führer, the British leader tried to get the small nation to join his side, but the Icelandic government refused. They had only about 120,000 inhabitants, and did not even have a regular army that could stand up to one of the powers involved in the war. Therefore, they maintained their neutrality. However, the conquests of Norway and Denmark forced Churchill to take desperate measures. On May 10, 1940, the same day that the Germans began their attack on France, the British began the so-called Operation Fork. This was the name given to the invasion and subsequent occupation of Iceland. It was carried out by the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Marines, made up of about 750 British men. Most of them were conscripts, and only a few had received any kind of training. The vast majority had not even been given a rifle, having only pistols and bayonets. Still, this small force proved sufficient. When the soldiers disembarked from the ships in Reykjavik, they were confronted by the local police. Although they offered no armed resistance, they protested that they were violating the neutrality and independence of their country. But vastly outnumbered and outgunned, they could do nothing against the foreigners.
Iceland has grown from a land which was only interesting where the weather was peculiar to a military base of first-class importance. When Denmark fell to the Nazi invader, Britain forestalled any possibility of a German attempt to move against her sister nation, Iceland. British troops were dispatched immediately to take over the job of fortifying this land in the north, and they were surprised to find that it wasn't all ice and snow. This, in a sense, was an invasion, but it was the most friendly invasion in history, because the authorities in Iceland recognized that only by allowing Britain to undertake her defense could they be sure that Germany would be kept out.
The first thing they did was arrest citizens of German origin, including Werner Gerlach. The ambassador tried to burn all his documents before the British arrived, but some survived, including his personal diary. Supposedly, there was an altar to Hitler in his home. In addition, the British dismantled the communication networks and occupied the nearby villages to deny the Germans any place to land. They had completely isolated the country. Churchill promised the local government compensation, such as favorable trade deals. He also guaranteed them that they would not interfere in the island's politics, and that the garrison would completely withdraw after the war ended. At that time, no one suspected that it would last for another 5 years. Despite these promises, the citizens had a cold treatment towards the British. Many feared that their presence would provoke a German offensive, and they could fall victim to air raids or naval artillery attacks. Others felt that the English soldiers were a threat to the local female population, although there are no known records of any such incidents by foreigners. Operation Fork took Adolf Hitler by surprise. as he imagined that the British would respect Icelandic neutrality. His enemies now had a base with which to threaten his conquests in Northern Europe. German submarines, which were wreaking havoc on Allied convoys, had to be more careful, as their rivals' naval presence had increased considerably. For these reasons, he met with his top generals to discuss the possibility of a German invasion of Iceland. This was called Operation Icarus. But both Hermann Göring, leader of the Air Force, and Erich Raeder, commander of the Navy, had pessimistic views of being able to carry it out. They argued that while the island could be invaded and conquered, maintaining supply lines from mainland Europe would be very difficult due to the strong presence of English ships. In addition, they would need to use local airfields for their planes, but there were none on Icelandic soil, and they did not have the materials to build them. In fact, because they had no regular army, much of the infrastructure necessary to maintain an active force was not present. Hitler, much to his chagrin, called off the operation. But this island was not the only target in the Nazi leader's sights, and soon his eyes turned to other territories. France had fallen into German hands shortly after the British arrival in Iceland. The war continued to rage, both in southern Europe and on other continents, such as Africa and Asia. By mid-1941, the only Allied force still standing was the United Kingdom. The rest had been defeated. Although various groups of partisans, as civilians turned guerrillas were called, continued to fight behind enemy lines, the situation for Churchill was critical. He needed all the soldiers he could get to turn the tide of the conflict. The British garrison in Iceland had grown to about 25,000 men in the months following the invasion, although the Nazis never gave any indication of wanting to attack the island. Therefore, the Prime Minister decided that these fighters would be more useful on another front. But there was a problem. He could not leave the country without any armed forces, as that would be an open invitation for Hitler to land there. They came up with an unorthodox but effective solution. They asked the United States to occupy the island in their place. At this point, the Americans had not yet entered the war, although they never concealed their sympathy for the Allied side. Being out of the conflict, they initially refused the British request. But after negotiations with the Icelandic government, the three countries agreed. The official deal was that the neutral American force would move to the Nordic nation to assist them with non-war tasks, although everyone was aware that this was an excuse. On July 7, 1941, the Americans landed on Icelandic territory with about 20,000 men. The British were able to free tens of thousands of fighters, and the Icelanders did not have to fear reprisals from the Nazis. However, just like the British, not all locals were grateful to the new inhabitants.
While in Iceland, the Americans start building roads and bunkers and ports and bases.
The United States Army is laying better road beds and is widening and strengthening the bridges to permit the passage of heavier trucks and tanks.
This is stuff that is still there today. A lot of Icelanders see this as a blessing, since it helped upgrade their infrastructure, helped give them big, beautiful roads around the country. But rightfully so, many feel like they were used as a pawn by these superpowers that violated their sovereignty in the name of geostrategy, which is absolutely what happened.
There were many cases of Icelandic women having relations with American soldiers stationed there. There are records of 255 babies born from these unions. Many locals viewed this in a negative light and accused their compatriots of being prostitutes and even traitors. A large number of them were imprisoned, although they were later released when it was proven that most of the relationships had been consensual. With the attack on the American base at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese on December 7, 1941, the United States finally joined the war on the side of the Allies. Its units were scattered around the world, both in the Pacific and in North Africa. But several regiments were also sent to Iceland. The presence of Uncle Sam's soldiers reached 50,000 troops, which was almost a third of the country's total population. The addition of the Americans gave the Allies a breath of fresh air, and by the end of 1942, the Germans had lost their advantage. When Hitler learned that his enemies had built airfields in Iceland, he was furious, mostly at Göring, who had informed him of the impossibility of doing so. He quickly put a plan to invade the island back into motion, but it was never carried out as the Reich had much more pressing matters to attend to. Meanwhile, all the turmoil in the small country caused it to begin to feel like it was independent. The Icelandic government was officially an autonomous territory under the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark, but on May 23, 1944, a referendum was passed that turned it into a republic. By this time, Germany had lost much of the territory previously conquered. This worsened as the months passed until, in April 1945, its enemies were in Berlin. Hitler and Eva Braun, who had once vacationed on the European island, took their own lives in an underground bunker on April 30th. Just a few days later, on May 8th, the remaining German leaders signed an unconditional surrender of their forces. But even though the war was over, Iceland was still occupied. In 1946, a treaty was signed between the Nordic country and the United States, which stipulated the withdrawal of its soldiers within 6 months. It also stated that all construction work carried out by British or American forces would be transferred to the local government. But Uncle Sam pushed for another agreement, according to which the Americans would take over the defense of the country for an indefinite period. It was not until 2006, more than 60 years after their arrival on the island, that the last troops were withdrawn. Despite its remote location, Iceland proved to be a coveted territory for many of the combatants of World War II. Germans, English, and Americans tried to take it over, and some even succeeded for a while. Despite this, the local government only grew stronger, gaining its independence at a time when many countries were losing theirs. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, do you think the Allied occupation of Iceland can be excused? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.